Okay, let's unpack this. You've sent us some really interesting sources, and for this deep dive, we're tackling a big one, secularism. And this is episode 15, where we're exploring secularism not just as, an absence of faith, but really as an ethical vision, something rooted in reason, compassion, and humility based on the material you provided.
That's right. And it's easy, I think it's often the first thing people jump to, defining secularism negatively. Just not believing in gods, not going to church or temple, not doing the rituals. It gets seen as sort of a void.
Right, like something's missing.
Mm.
And if it's only defined by what it isn't, it can feel, well, pretty hollow, can it? Maybe even amoral, like there's no positive core there.
Exactly. I mean, few people really build a strong identity just around what they don't do or what they don't believe. But what's fascinating in these sources we looked at is how self-professed secularists often see it completely differently. They view it as a very positive, quite active worldview built around a specific, coherent code of values.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, based on the sources. This view, it isn't necessarily anti-religion, is it?
No, not at all. The sources really highlight that many of these core secular values, they're actually share across lots of different religious traditions. You find echoes of them with Muslims, Christians, Hindus,
Mm.
and atheists too, of course.
So that really pushes back against the idea that secularism thinks it has some kind of monopoly on, wisdom or goodness.
Right. The material suggests that proponents of this kind of positive secularism, they don't believe morality is handed down just to one group or from one single divine source. It's viewed more as a natural human legacy, something you kind of expect to pop up in societies all over the globe, just
Like,
in different forms.
so it's not like some religious frameworks that might present a clear in or out, you're either with us or you're not. This definition of secularism seems much more comfortable with complexity, with hybrid identities.
Yeah, exactly. You could stick to this positive secular ethical code while still, practicing your faith, praying to Allah, eating halal, making the Hajj, whatever it might be.
As long as, and this seems key, when there is a genuine conflict, the secular commitment, the one based on evidence and shared humanity, sort of takes precedence.
That seems to be the idea presented. And this ethical code, which the sources argue is accepted, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly by millions across different beliefs, it includes some really foundational values.
Yeah, like truth, compassion, equality, freedom, courage, and responsibility.
Yeah.
Big ones.
Absolutely. And if you step back, these are pretty much the principles that underpin, well, the most successful parts of modern science and democratic institutions.
Now, it's really important to remember, and the sources stress this, that like any ethical code, this secular code is an ideal.
Oh, definitely. Secular society, secular institutions, they often fall way short of it. Just like, Christian societies historically fell short of Christian ideals.
Right. Think about medieval France, called itself a Christian kingdom, but wasn't exactly embodying humility and universal charity all the time.
Or even modern France, a secular state, which you could argue took some pretty troubling liberties with freedom, especially for women early on.
Yeah, so falling short doesn't mean there's no moral compass. It just means ideals are hard, really hard to live up to in the real world. So our goal here in this deep dive is to really understand this positive, active, ethical vision of secularism, the one rooted in these values.
Okay, so let's unpack it. Maybe start with the commitment to truth.
All right, so this commitment, it's not about faith in the religious sense or just believing something really strongly. It's grounded in observation, in evidence.
hmm And a key difference the material points out is that secularists, in this positive sense, they don't sanctify one group or one person or one book as the final word on truth. Instead, the reverence is for truth itself, wherever you find it, however you discover it.
Whether that's digging up fossil bones, looking at distant galaxies, crunching data, or even studying the wisdom in diverse human traditions.
Yeah. And this commitment is really the engine behind modern science, isn't it? It lets us do incredible things. Splitting atoms, decoding genomes, tracking evolution, understanding history in ways we just couldn't before.
Okay, so truth first. Then there's this deep commitment to compassion. And the sources suggest this isn't just about obeying divine rules.
Right, it's more fundamental. It comes from really appreciating suffering, understanding what it means.
So the reason you don't murder someone isn't just because an old book says don't do it.
Exactly. It's because killing causes immense, unbearable suffering to another sentient being. And the sources do note the potential danger in just relying on God says so, especially if, historically or potentially, a perceived divine command involves harming others. heretics, non-believers, witches, whoever.
That does raise a tricky question, though, which the sources get into. How do secular ethics handle really tough dilemmas without an absolute rule book from on high?
Well, the suggestion is it involves a process. Carefully weighing the feelings of everyone involved, looking at all the evidence, all the observations, and consciously trying to find the path that causes the least amount of harm overall. It's about minimizing suffering.
You see that applied to big societal issues, right? Like taxing the rich to help the poor, or deciding if a war against a dictator is justified, or policies on refugees. The focus is always on the real-world impact on well-being.
Yeah. And it extends to personal stuff, too, like sexuality. The ethical question becomes, does it hurt people?
So rape is obviously unethical because it's profoundly harmful. But a loving, consensual relationship between two adults, if it harms no one, there's no ethical basis to forbid it, regardless of gender.
The source even tackles some challenging analogies to make this point. Remember the man and goat marriage comparison? From this secular viewpoint, focusing on human well-being, the issue isn't some ritual's validity. It's about whether the relationship can actually support human flourishing. A goat just can't provide the emotional, intellectual, spiritual depth for that kind of partnership.
Right. And the example of incest, say, between a father and daughter.
The sources point to just overwhelming evidence, psychological, social, of the immense, often irreparable harm done to the child. Evolution itself seems to have shaped us against mixing romantic and parental bonds.
So you don't actually need a divine law. Just studying the science, the psychology, reveals the harm.
Precisely. And that really underlines why scientific truth is so deeply valued in this secular view. It's not just curiosity. It's seen as essential for guiding compassion effectively. Without understanding reality through evidence, our desire to help, to reduce suffering, it could be blind, even counterproductive.
Okay, so these two commitments, truth and compassion, they seem to naturally lead into the next one. Equality.
That's the argument. The material suggests secular people are inherently suspicious of what they call a priori hierarchies.
Meaning
Those hierarchies that are just assumed from the start, Declaring one group inherently better or worse than another without evidence. From this perspective, suffering is suffering, no matter who feels it. Knowledge is knowledge, no matter who discovers it.
And if you privilege one group's experience or discoveries over others, well, that just leads to being callous towards some people and ignorant about reality.
Yeah. It means secular people can be proud of their own nation, their culture, its unique aspects, but without confusing that uniqueness with inherent superiority. They acknowledge duties to their nation, sure, but also see broader duties to all of humanity.
And, of course, if you're committed to seeking truth and easing suffering, you absolutely need freedom.
You do. Freedom to think, freedom to investigate, freedom to experiment, and crucially, freedom to challenge the status quo, to question existing ideas.
Which explains why secular frameworks really cherish freedom and tend to avoid putting ultimate, unquestionable authority in just one text or one institution or one leader.
Right. The ability to doubt, to check facts, to get a second opinion, to try different approaches that's seen as completely essential.
And they admire people who showed that kind of courage, don't they?
Yeah. Figures like Galileo risking everything for what he observed, or the crowds storming the Bastille, demanding liberation, or someone like Rosa Parks, quietly insisting on equality.
Speaking of courage, there's the obvious courage needed to fight bias and oppression. That's vital. But the sources seem to highlight an even maybe greater kind of courage.
Yeah, the courage to admit ignorance, to admit you don't know, and the courage to venture into that unknown.
So a key goal of secular education, as described here, is actually teaching you to say, I don't know, and then to actively look for new evidence and be willing to doubt what you thought you knew.
Which is really the opposite of that fear of the unknown, that craving for simple black and white answers that can just paralyze people or societies.
And history seems to bear that out, doesn't it? The sources observe that societies willing to admit ignorance, to ask the hard questions, often end up more prosperous, more peaceful, than those demanding absolute, unquestioning faith in a single answer, often supposedly divinely given. People who are terrified of losing their truth can sometimes become much more violent than people who are just used to dealing with multiple perspectives.
And that line from the source really sticks. Questions you cannot answer are often far better for you than answers you cannot question.
Powerful stuff.
Okay, last core value on the list. Responsibility.
Right. And the core idea here is pretty simple. Secular people in this framework don't generally believe there's some higher power who's going to swoop in and fix the world's problems. That responsibility, it rests squarely on us, On human shoulders.
So it's our job, our duty, to figure out solutions for poverty, for disease, for conflict, for human misery in general. And by this definition, secular people take, immense pride in human achievements, curing epidemics, feeding billions, making peace in some areas. They see these things as the direct result of human knowledge, human ingenuity, and human compassion working together.
But, and this is crucial, that also means taking full responsibility for the dark side of modernity, too.
Absolutely. The genocides, the illogical destruction, all the unintended horrific consequences of our actions and technologies, you can't just blame it on fate or divine will.
So instead of just praying for a miracle,
The call to action is, okay, what can we actually do right here, right now? How can we help fix this?
so when you look at secularism through this lens, defined by these commitments, truth, compassion, equality, freedom, courage, responsibility, it's anything but empty or amoral.
Far from it. It presents a really demanding ethical code. In fact, the source suggests the main problem might be that it sets the ethical bar almost too high for us flawed humans to consistently reach.
And that brings us to the shadow, doesn't it? The idea that this very demanding ideal is just incredibly difficult to keep hold of, especially in a crisis, when you need quick action, clear rules, catchy slogans to get people moving.
That's exactly it. In those moments of pressure, emergencies, rapid change, even movements rooted in reason and open inquiry they can mutate. They can harden into dogmatic creeds. Look at Marxism, for instance. It started with Marx calling for, critical investigation of history and economics. But under the immense pressures of revolution, war, consolidation of power, it hardened. By the time you get to someone like Stalin, it demanded unquestioning faith in the party, in the leader. And that led to unimaginable suffering, justified by these chilling phrases like, oh, revolution isn't a picnic, or you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
And it's interesting how the definition matters there. If you just use the negative definition, secular means doesn't believe in God, then yeah, Stalin was secular. But if you use this positive definition we've been discussing, committed to evidence-based truth, compassion, freedom from dogma,
then Marx might fit parts of the description, perhaps, but Stalin looks much more like the fanatical high priest of a new, godless, but utterly dogmatic religion.
And it's not just communism, is it? The source points fingers elsewhere, too.
Oh, yeah. It suggests even capitalism, which arguably started as a more open-ended theory about how economies might work best, has, in some versions, solidified into its own kind of rigid dogma, repeating mantras about free markets and endless growth, even when the negative consequences are obvious, just dismissing them as, oh, those are just growing pains.
And even movements we might think are closer to the ideal, like liberal democracies.
Even they aren't immune. While often more aligned with pursuing truth and compassion, the source suggests they can still fall back on comforting dogmas, like an almost unquestioning faith that general elections are some kind of magic bullet for all political problems.
Even when they demonstrably fail sometimes, or even lead to majority rule trampling minorities.
Right. And as the source rather dryly puts it, if you dare to question that particular dogma, you might not end up in a gulag, but you can probably still expect a cold shower of dogmatic abuse.
Okay, but the material is careful not to say all dogmas are automatically bad, right? It uses human rights as a key example.
Yes, that's a really provocative part of the analysis. The argument presented is that rights aren't like, laws of physics waiting to be discovered. They're powerful stories humans invented and agreed upon. And the human rights framework specifically was kind of enshrined as a dogma during really tough struggles against religious bigotry and absolute monarchies, autocratic governments.
And look at the positive impact. It's been incredible, hasn't it? Curbing dictators, protected minorities, contributing hugely to reducing poverty and violence worldwide.
Absolutely. The source acknowledges it might be one of the most beneficial doctrines humans have come up with recently. But the source insists it's still a dogma. Believing in natural or inherent rights, while incredibly useful in practice, might actually prevent you from fully understanding yourself or understanding history. You miss seeing how these powerful ideas were constructed in response to very specific historical problems.
And that lack of deeper insight, while maybe okay when fighting obvious villains like Nazis or Stalinists, could be, the source warns, potentially fatal in the 21st century. Because the human rights framework, built to fight 20th century monsters, might just be poorly equipped for the completely different challenges coming from, say, biotech and AI.
Yeah, things like potentially overcoming death, or algorithms that manipulate us in ways we don't even perceive, or the possibility of genetically engineered superhumans.
Or even just the more subtle creeping challenges of, say, hyperconsumerism or seductive technological utopias, the old rulebook might not apply.
Which brings us back to acknowledging the shadow. This is crucial. The sources argue secularism isn't the same thing as Stalinism or the destructive parts of industrialization and colonialism.
No, of course not.
But it can't just wash its hands and shirk all responsibility either.
How so?
Well, the grand promises of using reason and science to perfect humanity and master nature, they led to amazing triumphs, yes, like conquering plagues,
Right.
but they also paved the way, inadvertently or not, for disasters like the gulags, like melting ice caps. Simply saying, oh, that was just a distortion of the ideal, well, it's true.
But
But that excuse is available to every influential movement, as the source points out. Christianity can't just wave away the Inquisition or the Crusades by saying they were distortions of a religion of love. They have to seriously ask, how did our core beliefs allow these things to happen again and again?
And the same applies, the source argues, to Marxists looking at Stalinism, or scientists looking at the unforeseen consequences of their discoveries, or geneticists contemplating the future.
Exactly. Every powerful creed casts a shadow, and the big danger is the naive belief that, oh, it couldn't happen to us.
Okay, but there's an advantage here for undogmatic secular science, isn't there?
Yes, a huge one, according to the material. It's precisely its willingness to confront its shadow. It isn't terrified of admitting mistakes, admitting blind spots.
Because if your whole system is based on some absolute, infallible truth, then admitting any error, any flaw, feels like it could bring the whole thing crashing down.
Right. But if you see seeking truth as this ongoing quest by inherently fallible humans, then admitting you messed up or got something wrong, that's not a crisis. That's just part of the process, expected, even necessary.
And you see that difference in the kinds of promises made, too. Undogmatic secular approaches tend to promise modest, incremental improvements, small steps.
Whereas it's the more dogmatic ideologies, the ones brimming with self-confidence and
Mhm.
claims of absolute truth, that tend to vow the impossible. You know, eternal purity, total redemption, saving the entire world with one grand gesture.
So as we face these huge, potentially species-altering decisions about technology, about the environment, about the future of life itself,
The source offers a really potent piece of advice. When you're deciding who to trust, especially with the big calls, trust the people who admit ignorance more than the ones who claim infallibility.
it really leaves you, the listener, with this challenging question, doesn't it? If you want your worldview, whatever it is, to lead humanity forward, what's the biggest mistake it ever made? What did it get fundamentally wrong?
Because, as the sources suggest, the ability to actually grapple with that question seriously and honestly about your own beliefs, maybe that's the most reliable sign of trustworthiness there is.
Absolutely. Wow. This deep dive, thanks to your sources, has given us a massive amount to think about regarding secularism, not just as absence, but as this really demanding ethical vision,
Yeah.
its values, its immense challenges, the danger of dogma, and, yeah, the vital importance of humility in acknowledging that shadow.
It certainly has. Thanks again for bringing these fascinating materials to us. Definitely a lot to ponder long after we stop talking.